Welcome to the Mind Gut Conversation, your go-to podcast for exploring cutting-edge ideas in optimal health and the fascinating science of mind-gut microbiome interactions. I'm your host, Emeran Mayer. Here we bring together thought leaders, groundbreaking researchers, and innovative practitioners to share insights that can transform the way you understand your body, mind, and overall well-being. Whether you're a health enthusiast, a curious learner, or a professional in the field, this podcast is your gateway to unlocking the secrets of the mind-gut connection. So settle in, open your mind, and join us as we journey into the science and stories shaping the future of health. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Cheryl Sew Hoy, who is the CEO and founder of Tiny Health, the leading microbiome health platform, helping individuals and families to optimize their gut and vaginal microbiome. In this podcast, we talk about the leaky gut and gut inflammation, and if the Tiny Health stool test is able to detect such abnormalities and the upstream microbiome changes that precede the development of them. We also discuss if stool and vaginal microbiome testing are useful in the diagnosis and management of gut-related symptoms in the perimenopause or menopause stages. Cheryl holds a master's in engineering, management, and data mining and a bachelor's in operation research and industrial engineering from Cornell University and is a highly successful serial entrepreneur. Launched in 2022, Tiny Health pioneered the first at-home gut microbiome test for moms and babies using shotgun metagenomic sequencing. Since then, it has expanded to serve adults and older children, offering advanced testing for chronic conditions, performance, longevity, and overall health. If you're interested in assessing and improving your gut and vaginal microbiome, you don't want to miss this episode. Welcome to the show, Cheryl. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today. We have interacted in the past in different capacities, and I've done your microbiome stool test myself, and I've been impressed by it. So can you tell me a little bit about your journey to create Tiny Health?
Yeah, sure. I'm so excited to be here with you as well. I created Tiny Health out of my own two different birth stories, actually, my two kids, my first two kids. My first kid was born via C-section, and she had some antibiotic exposure through my operation, and she didn't go through my vaginal canal. And so I was doing research on what a C-section would the impact of a C-section to my baby's lifelong health, if there was any. And I uncovered a lot of the research around the fact that the baby is actually sterile in the womb. There's some microbial functional impact from mom to baby, but there's no actual seeding happening, no colonization happening in the baby's gut. But so when the baby is born, it first swallows the vaginal microbes from the mom on the way out, and then some fecal fluid as well during the labor process. And then after birth, the breast milk, breastfeeding, you're continuing to transfer the gut microbes from the mom to baby. And that's how the kind of early life seeding happens. And I learned that this is really important for the baby's lifelong health because the gut immune training happens in the first 1,000 days, but more crucially in the first 3 months of life. So what bacteria colonizes the infant's gut from mom or the environment really does matter. So I was looking through that research, and then around 6 months, my daughter got eczema and food allergies and gluten, dairy intolerance, all that kind of stuff I was reading in research. So I was kind of like, oh my gosh, how do I course correct my daughter's gut? So I was doing all those things, extended breastfeeding. I was giving her a probiotic. I was doing kefir, but I was trying to measure. I really wanted to find a way to measure her gut to figure out if I was course correcting it and de-risking her from asthma, for example, because she already had eczema and allergies, and I wanted to stop the atopic condition from progressing to asthma. And I couldn't find a gut test for infants at that point. So when I was pregnant with my son, I started the company a week after he was born. And yeah, that's how Tiny Health was born. He ended up being a vaginal birth. and he does not have any eczema, allergies, and his gut was perfect at birth. I was able to measure it. So I started Tiny Health from my own need of, reading all these papers and so much science around the first 1,000 days and the importance of the vertical transmission of microbes from mom to baby and how it maps to lifelong immune training of the child. And then kind of like being able to course correct if there were major imbalances in the infant's gut as it relates to reduction of chronic conditions in kids. I was really compelled by that. And I'm like, the world needs this. I need this for my kids. And I felt like, I realized that it takes 10 to 15 years for groundbreaking academic research to be implemented in medical practice. And for a good reason, probably there needs to be more scientific evidence and all that. But for me, I needed if the first 1,000 days was such a critical time window, I can't wait 10 years. So I wanted to build a really evidence-based company based on the research I was reading.
Yeah, that's a wonderful origin story, I would say, and I'm kind of surprised that you were the first one that really focused on these first 1,000 days, because clearly this whole what's evolving is the programming phase, both of the immune system and of the gut microbiome and the brain gut interactions. I mean, that's the most important part of the whole system. It's not, once it's programmed, yes, you can still modify it, but to assess it right at the beginning, I think is really by far the most important step. So, as you know, stool microbiome tests have become very popular amongst the public. I rarely see or meet a patient that hasn't undergone some stool testing and comes to me with pages and pages of reports that they can't really make much out of it. So they're particularly popular amongst people who are concerned about their gut health, which is another hot topic nowadays, or patients who have had gut-related symptoms for which the doctors don't have an explanation or treatment. So one rationale for you has been really the looking at this programming phase, but I would imagine you also have a lot of customers that are characterized by what I just said, people that are obsessed nowadays with gut health, that even though they don't know exactly, they couldn't exactly define it, what they mean with it.
Exactly. Well, I was kind of one of those people I'm a tracker. I track my sleep with the Aura Ring. I track all my biometrics and do the blood biomarkers and all that. So I'm kind of like more of along the biohacker kind of type of persona. And then I've always paid attention to gut health. That's what brought me to this topic when I gave birth to my babies, and the curiosity of what happens in early life, right? That brought me to creating Tiny Health. And so, I was also surprised that there's no product in the market focusing on this really important stage. But I think it's because there's, it takes a mom who has this problem for her babies to create this product, right? To try to solve it for her family. So in a way, I had been a prior entrepreneur before this, and then, was figuring out what to do for my next company and really wanted to solve a problem that was really meaningful and impactful in the world. So now, like fast forward, we've been in the market for a few years now. We served over 60,000 families. And once the parents, because we launched with the baby gut test, once the parents find how impactful we are for the children's gut health, they take a sample themselves too. So, we have a ton of adult customers, and then of course, as you mentioned, a lot of other adult customers who don't even have kids are coming to us when they have chronic conditions or maybe even like a mysterious symptom. They're not sure what the root cause is, and they want to figure out if the gut microbiome could be a root cause. They do a Tiny Health test, and oftentimes we do find, some imbalances that they can course correct in that route. But, like to your earlier statement, you mentioned that, gut health is almost everyone has done a stool test. I would actually challenge that because I think yeah, maybe the people who are having some symptoms, they have looked into it. But for the majority of people, like the demographic I'm primarily serving from the baby gut, the parents who maybe they're not tackling a chronic condition themselves, but their babies are, they've never heard of a gut test
Hmm.
before. Yeah, so when they come to us, they're like, I didn't even know we can do this for babies, what not for us, for the adults.
So you also serve like an educational or like an awareness purpose. I mean, which is
Yeah.
great because, yeah, I always feel that pregnant mothers or mothers that are planning a pregnancy are really not aware of all these things that like this the antibiotic use. I mean, one dose, like in animals, we know that one dose of antibiotics in a pregnant mouse, for example, can have a long-lasting effect. And also, I mean, the routine of using prophylactic antibiotics in the delivery room. So there's a lot of things that women are not aware of. What
No, something like 60% of women get antibiotic drips in labor, which is kind of crazy, right? Like that's a huge number. And I think our C-section rates are 33% now in this country.
Yeah.
Um, but I think as Americans, we're very optimistic during pregnancy that, oh, it's not going to happen to me or everything will be fine. And so the preventative measures is just not kind of front and center to us. I mean, not everybody. Certainly, I'm the profile who would research ahead of time. But for the majority, I think there's definitely a reliance on their OBGYN or a medical professional to tell them what to do, I think, right? So I think we do appeal a bit more to the group of people who are a bit more proactive. That said, when we launched, we had two campaigns. We had a campaign targeting moms who are pregnant to prep for the birth and educating them around that. And then we had a campaign targeting, babies who have eczema and allergies and things like that, colicky symptoms, sleep issues, and whatnot. Nobody cared about the pregnancy campaign. Like we had pretty like bad results there. And then the baby campaign was so successful.
Mm.
And this goes to show uh, we're just a more reactive creature, like which makes sense. We react when there's a problem, and when there isn't a problem, it's more like a vitamin. I can take it or leave it, and then the other one is a painkiller, right? Like I have a problem right now. I can't figure out. My conventional doctors can't figure it out. Help me. This is kind of like my last resort. So they come to us.
Yeah, and this is sort of a sad situation because, I mean, it's, for example, like obesity or metabolic syndrome in a pregnant mother, we know is a big risk factor for probably through the mother's microbiome influencing the brain development, not the microbes themselves going to the brain of the fetus, but the mother's inflammatory response. And I don't believe that there's a lot of awareness of what important factors in pregnancy. And I would say, stress medications and obesity are probably the three, and diet are the three major factors that should be part of a, pregnancy educational campaign to, um,
100%. Yeah. I think that's our vision initially, but I think like we just have to be as a company, as a small startup with limited resources where people kind of like gravitate towards. So that's kind of why when we launched in 2022, the baby gut test was so popular, but now we're seeing more awareness. People are like having their next babies. And so now the moms and dads both are prepping for their
mm,
gut
mm,
microbiome
mm.
for their next pregnancy. And then the vaginal microbiome too, because baby is kind of passing that route as well. So you want to keep your vaginal microbiome healthy as well. So I kind of knew that was the cycle. And then as we have more clinical evidence as well, we just finished a prospective clinical study with 52 infants that showed really good results in prevention of chronic conditions. We're extending that to a cohort of 800 infants, and might even include the mom, like the prenatal stages, to course correct the mom early on, right? But that's obviously a longer study and it takes more money. But we do think it's imperative that we move upstream to even not just like conception, but preconception,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Preparing
yeah.
the gut and vaginal microbiome can take months. For
Yeah.
adults, it could take 3 to 6 months, maybe even 8, 9 months to course correct if there are major imbalances. So yeah, that's the eventual goal.
I mean, I'd love to hear this from somebody like you. It should come from the OB/GYN community, not from a company's CEO as yourself. And it's sadly that has not been the case. It's not come from the medical side. So let me jump to the next thing, and maybe you can just give a brief comment on each of these. So the four major benefits that you list on your website. Can you expand just a little bit on each of these? Maybe let's start with the first one, get to the root cause of chronic conditions. And you already mentioned that, a little bit in the last few minutes, but if you can.
Yeah, yeah. So like if you have, again, there's so many chronic conditions, right? It could be skin issues or eczema, psoriasis. It could be autoimmune conditions, thyroid issues, um, diabetes, there's just so many things, or seasonal allergies too, right? So oftentimes, like the reason why we look at the gut microbiome is because 80%, 70 to 80% of our immune cells are behind that gut lining wall, right? And so sometimes these chronic conditions is immune mediated, like eczema, asthma, and whatnot. And it's the immune cells kind of overreacting or reacting haphazardly to perhaps an overabundance of pathogens that are maybe crossing the gut lining. And we can talk about that later. So gut inflammation could be a factor as a root cause to these chronic conditions, and it's causing different like symptoms to manifest, right? And like beyond that, we always blame bad bacteria as the culprit of a lot of major diseases or ailments, but actually like research is showing that the depletion of beneficial bacteria and functions are at the core of it, right? And this is kind of part of your research as well. It is something that with Tiny Health, we want to bring more awareness that sometimes the root cause is lack of these beneficial stuff. And you can only get these beneficial stuff or microbes, if you're eating a healthy diet, right? So diet, maybe supplements can kind of help with that. Lifestyle changes is at the core of, fixing the root cause of some of these inflammation and chronic conditions.
Yeah,
Would
I
you
mean,
agree?
I would say, we are just at the beginning of understanding the full spectrum and implications of the gut microbiome for health. But one thing that seems to be at the moment, I sort of like this yin and yang concept that you have both inflammatory or bad microbes, and you have the beneficial, which are mainly the ones that produce these anti-inflammatory compounds like short chain fatty acids and butyrate, and that's obviously also an oversimplification. It's the balance between these two groups. If you have an abundance of the anti-inflammatory species, that will protect you, even if there are some of the not so beneficial bacteria in your gut. And I think right now, working hypotheses, we're no longer so looking for, like in traditional microbiology, for the single bad pathogenic microbe. It's an ecosystem, and the balance in this ecosystem is influenced by multiple players.
100%. Yeah, exactly. I think like in the past and even now with, obviously with the pandemic and all that, people are very fixated in bad pathogenic bacteria or viruses and killing it, right? So a lot of the approaches in conventional medicine, even some functional medicine, is to kill, kill, kill. Whereas really, like you mentioned, there is a balance. It's not just the bad guys who should be killed and expelled. You have to also restore the beneficial. And I think we just need to educate people more on that balance, like you mentioned, because if you have a healthy immune system with these beneficial functions, it shouldn't be so weak when you are exposed to pathogens like E. coli. We're exposed to that daily, just from like, I don't know, walking outside and kind of like handling animals or pets and
Yeah,
like surfaces. We're exposed to pathogens all the time, but your healthy immune system is supposed to safeguard against that, right?
yeah, exactly. Let me get to the second point, which which I think is really an important one. So recover from antibiotic exposure. That is definitely another challenge that a lot of people um, experience. And so how would the tiny health test help you with that?
Yeah, we always like to sort of get someone's baseline tests before medication, for example. And this is especially crucial in the first 1,000 days. So if you have a young child, infant who's under like 3 years old, this is even more critical because a lot of kids, I think an average kid gets 2 rounds of antibiotics for ear infections. in the first year or something like that. The stats are pretty staggering. But even for adults, like, ideally we have your baseline state of gut microbiome. And then if in case you did need medication like antibiotics that are broad spectrum as opposed to narrow spectrum means that it could destroy everything, all the microbes in your gut, right? Not just the bad, but also the beneficial. And if you don't take care in restoring what was then destroyed, some of the beneficial bacteria may never come back. So relevant to that earlier point, I think antibiotic overuse is the number one like factor why we're so depleted today and why our society is getting sicker and sicker, and why even we find most people are missing bifidobacteria and archimencia and have low butyrate function because of antibiotic overuse. And we think of antibiotic as like a medication that we take, but sometimes it can also surface as in the food supply chain, right? If you eat maybe conventional meat, where there's a lot of antibiotics given to the poultry, the cow, the chicken, and whatnot, or in produce that's sprayed with herbicides, right? Roundup and things like that. That can also be damaging to your gut. And also cleaning supplies, if we're using harsh chemicals that are antibacterial soap, and you're exposed to it, that can also affect your microbiome. So, but in short, like I think for this use case, if you ever needed medication like antibiotics in the future, having that original baseline gut and then taking the medication and then sampling maybe 4 weeks after to see what happens after will guide you in how to restore the beneficial functions of bacteria that you had before that you may not have now.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. And I'm going to throw in, you said that antibiotics in our food chains. I'm a scientific consultant to a company that's focused on treating or preventing inflammatory conditions in some of our farm animals. And it's amazing to me, this has opened my eyes, what actually goes on there and what we eat. So at least a third of cows and pigs, they go through a phase of intestinal inflammation. And then what the response of the farm system is, a given antibiotic, which is usually not indicated, or so it's probably the majority of animals, unless they're labeled organic, will be exposed to antibiotics. And it's to a point that you almost feel like, if you're not a vegetarian, you would want to become a vegetarian because you don't want to consume antibiotics every day on your plate, so it's widespread. And as you say, I mean, then taking a medication on top of that is particularly, harmful.
Yeah, yeah. We have a metric in our tests called antibiotic resistance index. So we can actually measure if you have an abundance or what abundance of antibiotic resistant bacteria you have in your gut and the variety of it. So it's really interesting to see. And that index is important. So because like if you did require antibiotics as a medication, then if your index is high, then you should take extra care because they may actually bloom even worse,
Mm.
right? So there are specific probiotics that you can take in conjunction with the antibiotics. I used to think that that doesn't make sense because the antibiotics will kill the probiotics you're taking. But since then, I've learned that if you spread it out a little bit, like maybe take the probiotics during the day and the antibiotics at night, and spread it out a little bit. And there, I believe there are some papers showing there are benefits to restoration if you take it at the same time, and then after eat a fiber-rich diet and take specific probiotics that will support your restoration can really help.
Have you found, because you've done this test now in some 60,000 people, as you said, have you found there's a widespread prevalence of antibiotic resistance in the baseline of your?
No, I mean, I would need my data scientists to dig deeper into that, but not it's not like alarmingly, but definitely in people who report more symptoms and chronic conditions, we see an underlying baseline higher for sure than the healthy people. So it is correlated with symptoms.
Okay.
Mhm.
The third point they list on your website, so track and optimize your family's health.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so I talk a lot earlier about the first 1,000 days and how important that early life immune training is. And then oftentimes when parents come to us trying to solve their infants' problems and we help resolve them, or their toddlers. We really encourage them to check their gut too, like the mom, and the mom usually does it because if she's breastfeeding, she wants to know that her gut microbes are still healthy because she's again transferring that gut microbes to her baby through the breast milk, right? So that's a really good connection. And then the dad, actually there's a paper showing that the dad contributes 20 to 25% of his gut microbes to the infant at birth. And in the first year, it remains around 20%. So dad's guts matter too. And the other thing is like your infant is going to eventually eat what the family eats, live in the same environment, breathe the same household air, things like that, right? So if you're so focused on, fixing or rebalancing your baby's gut, but you're not caring about your own gut, guess what? Your child's gut is going to look like yours when they grow older, right? So like gut health is not just like, in the baby gut, because we spend a lot of our resources when we have a child on our babies, but not enough on ourselves. So we do often encourage families to look into their gut health as well, because it's a lifestyle change. It's about, again, diet, maybe supplements if you're inclined to, but lifestyle changes as well. So the whole family needs to pay attention around gut health, not just in the early stages, but for life.
Okay, yes. The last point, learn the best ways to support the gut that you list.
Mm-hmm.
How would you come from doing the testing to, a recommendation like actionable points, what you can do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where when I started the company, I didn't want to just give people a report of what all the bacteria or microbes in your gut is and the functions. I really wanted it to be actionable and evidence-based. So everything that we suggest from a personalized recommendation perspective have at least a few PubMed articles linked to it. So you can click to see what those articles are. For example, if we discovered that your gut has low fiber digestion capacity, and specifically, we can see if it's resistant starch that's low or cellulose or pectin. There are different kind of types of fiber. So for resistant starch, you can either eat more green bananas or cool down your potatoes and rice to retain more resistant starch. So we link to the evidence supporting that to increase resistant starch in your gut, for example. So we give very specific advice like that and methods and foods to eat. We never tell people not to eat certain food groups. We believe, like, I don't know why some gut tests say that, like, don't eat vegetable or don't eat broccoli or don't eat blueberries. A healthy gut should be able to eat a diverse amount of foods, types of foods, right? Especially fiber. And so we never take the approach of telling you to avoid certain foods.
Yeah, I love that aspect because I mean our guts have evolved in evolution. Human guts have evolved over hundreds of millions of years from our ancestors, even to handle as much as possible in different environments and different geographic locations. Yeah, I think we should always have this general dietary guidance that you should eat a diet that has a high variety of a multitude of fruits and vegetables and other food components as well. So I totally agree with that on
And
this.
in fact, when, there's a lot of like food sensitivities now, right? A lot of people are like, oh, I don't feel good eating this, or I feel bloated eating that. I would even encourage you to look into your gut more, like do a tiny health test, because there may be an insufficiency of certain bugs who can digest that specific food. So it's a bit of chicken and egg sometimes when, say, someone comes back with low chitin, a type of fiber digestion, where you get more when you eat more like mushrooms, for example, or shrimp, like shells and things like that, insects, even if you are inclined to. So people might feel uncomfortable eating mushrooms, but to kind of solve that, you actually should eat a little bit. I know it's just uncomfortable, but to encourage the microbes that can digest mushroom, you kind of should be eating a little bit of it, right? To get that
Mm.
chitin levels up. So that's kind of our approach here is that we want to test and not guess to figure out what the problem areas are and why we may be reacting to certain foods, right?
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is really I'm really curious, and a lot of patients ask about this. So what makes Tiny Health stool tests and recommendations different from other commercially available tests? And therefore, why would a customer choose Tiny Health tests rather than the ones offered by, competing companies like Biome and Jonah? One point that I love that what you just said is that you have this concept of, if there is a deficiency of certain microbes that are specialized in breakdown of specific fibers, you actually train the microbiome or become an engineer or a gardener of your ecosystem in the gut to expand the variety. So what makes Tiny Health stool tests different than your competition?
Yeah, I will mention that. But before that, this point about, when we eat food, we think we're feeding ourselves, our body, right? But we're actually feeding the microbes in us, right? I think you mentioned this the other day in a webinar we did with Tiny Health. When you're pregnant, you eat for three, right? You eat for yourself, your baby, and the microbes, right? Which
Yeah.
is so true, right? So that some fiber we can't even digest is the microbes that digest and break down the fiber. So it's really, really important point I wanted to highlight. As far as answering your question on what makes us different, I think from comparing us with Viome or Jonah, I want to highlight the technology for a second, because I think this is at the core of why Tiny Health is able to create insights that some other companies can't create. So it brings me back to a bit of a history, right? So if you think about microbial, and you may know more than me, perhaps the history of like sequencing or like how we detect bacteria
Mhm.
or microbes, right? We started with culturing back in the 1900s, I believe, where you would, grow bacteria specific or specific bacteria like E. coli in a petri dish in a lab, right? So it's like easy to grow. And that is really like groundbreaking, right? However, you can't grow a lot of the gut microbes because most gut microbes they die when exposed to oxygen. So they're anaerobic. And so it's easier to grow pathogenic bacteria or culture pathogenic bacteria. So culturing technology has been used for some of these stool reports, but I would say it's a little bit more biased. And, I don't think culturing should be used to sequence the gut microbiome of a person. There are some PCR culturing tests in the market that doctors still use today. It's good if you want to find specific pathogenic bacteria, but it won't tell you
Mhm.
what's in your whole gut, right? So from culturing, then we moved on to PCR or qPCR. And most people know the PCR technology from the COVID test because it was all using PCR. And PCR is a process where you get what you probe for, right? You have to have the primers for, like, if you want to detect E. coli and Salmonella specifically, then you have these primers
Mhm.
to get that. So it's a very limited panel. So the trade-off is that you can detect it very like to very small abundance at very high accuracy, but it's going to tell you a limited piece of your gut, right? So how would you know if the PCR stool tests that your doctor ordered, it may only represent 1% of your gut, or maybe 5% of your gut, maybe 50%, who knows, right? So we think that clinically it's not useful to know only a piece of your gut. And again, like culturing, PCR testing is very focused on pathogens because that's just traditionally what research focus on. Like, there's very little beneficial stuff there. And then maybe like in the 2010s, whole genome sequencing came about with 16S, and that was the first groundbreaking technology where we can now see everything in a person's gut, 100%, right? The trade-off there is that 16S, which sequences a region of the bacteria, it can only see bacteria in your gut. So it can't sequence fungi or yeast or parasites. So now we come to where we are now, say in the past 10 years, shotgun metagenomic sequencing has become the gold standard in gut microbiome research from academia, right? So that's what we use at Tiny Health. We use shotgun sequencing, and that is also a form of whole genome sequencing, but it sequences yeast as well, or candida, parasites, viruses, archaea, so the full genome. And the superpower of shotgun is that we can do strain level sequencing because different strains perform different functions, or different species perform different functions, but strains are even more precise, right? So the probiotic you buy in the market, where you have the letters and numbers behind that species is the strain information. And that's really crucial for, depending on what you're trying to solve, right? And then the other benefit of shotgun is the gene functions, the genetic functional pathways of the microbial's capacity to produce certain beneficial or pathogenic functions. So we have all that, which is kind of why our test goes the next level on into your gut functions, which is more important than the microbes that are there. So we use that technology, and then other companies. I don't like to sort of, kind of diss other companies, but what about RNA, right? Viome is using RNA sequencing, and in a way, like RNA is a single helix kind of genome. So it's very unstable, right? You might have also heard it from mRNA vaccines from COVID. It dissipates really quickly. So similarly, RNA to measure the gut function is the gene expression of the microbes. So whether or not the gene expression is turned on and off at that moment in time is what the RNA technology is measuring. So we've had a lot of comments from people who've done RNA stool tests that if they take a stool test today and they're like vegan, and then they take a stool test tomorrow and they do a carnivore diet, their gut genes are going to be like expressed very differently, right? But even if you're not dramatic, if you take two stool tests one day apart and you're stressed and not stressed the next day, your results are going to be very different. It's too temporal. And that's kind of why the scientists and a lot of people from academia can't understand how we can recommend long-term dietary or supplements from something so temporary, right? It's kind of too fleeting in some sense. So that brings us to our DNA. So DNA of the microbes is what shotgun uses, and DNA is a very stable structure. So for adults, like it does take time, like, a lot of regimented discipline, dietary or supplement and lifestyle changes to really shift that microbial composition or functions. It may take 2 to 3 months and sometimes 6 to 9 months to really intervene to change that microbiome. So hopefully that answers your question. You did mention Jonah, which is a company leveraging AI to kind of find associations to conditions with the gut microbiome. They are using shotgun sequencing, which is great. However, they don't own the bioinformatics pipeline. They don't own basically, because they don't own their technology, they don't really show gene capacity or functional capacity pathways. And that is really at the forefront of where microbiome research is going. And we think that, that's just a big miss that we're not, they're not reporting on those functions. But that's where, Tiny Health will really expand into is the gene functional pathways of your microbes.
So yeah, I mean, this was a wonderful explanation. I think even for the lay public, this would be, one of the best quick explanations of these very complex technologies. But how would a lay person, so they see the advertisements, I mean, how would a lay person decide which way they should go? I mean, obviously, if they listen to this podcast, you make a very convincing point. But, the great majority of people will not have heard this.
Yeah, yeah. It's really tough, right? And sometimes when I explain these technical differences, people glaze over because it's too technical for them. But I would really encourage people to just dig into the technology and ask. Sometimes companies don't even disclose what technology they're using or why it's relevant, right? There is, you mentioned earlier, gut health is becoming more popular and trendy, but there is at the same time a lot of snake oil, and it's really hard for the regular lay person, consumer, to differentiate what is true innovation and what is snake oil. Especially, there's a ton of supplement companies, right, saying that their supplements or their drink or fizzy water, whatever, has, is a gut friendly and things like that. How evidential is that is really a big question mark. Similar to stool testing, there's definitely a lot of people using different technologies. But yeah, it's really hard, but I would encourage people to really, I think the idea of using shotgun sequencing for stool testing is quite, I think there is a consensus that that should be the technology that you'd use for stool microbiome tests for consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of fully agree with what you said towards the end, so for the consumer to differentiate from snake oil sellers, or even companies like, competing companies to Tiny Health. I had a test on it, and the recommendation was, you can't eat blueberries, which is kind of ridiculous, probably one of the most ridiculous statements. And then there's some people that, are omnipresent on the internet that promote these ideas. So I think it's very important. I mean, like one of my missions right now is, in addition to my academic activities, to do this public education, this effort to really get a message out and interact with people that have that same mission, So anyway, so we're definitely on the same wavelength here, and hopefully successful.
Yeah, and this is why we've invited you to come on our medical advisory board, right? We didn't even mention that, but that's why I think when we met and you did our tests, there was just so much alignment between what you believe in and have found and through research and what we do here. And I guess this is one of the ways we try to stand out is we align ourselves with reputable people who are doing research and in the field, like even medical practitioners who are treating patients and seeing that our test is clinically, because the clinical utility of our test is important. If we can't intervene and course correct and make people feel better, then what's the point, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, so we are as a company very like focus on getting really legitimate, incredible medical advisors and scientific advisors as well.
Let's jump to something very specific. So leaky gut and gut inflammation or immune activation have become also popular terms in the gut health conversation. Um, so a couple of questions. Is the Tiny Health stool test able to detect such abnormalities like leaky gut and inflammation and the upstream microbiome changes that precede the development of increased intestinal permeability, which is the scientific term for leaky gut, and immune activation?
Yeah, it's funny. We had this small chat like a few weeks ago, right? Like, what is leaky gut? It's such a popular term, and frankly, I like the scientists don't really like this term, right? Because it's like it could mean a lot of different. It could be misperceived and misinterpreted, right? It's like not like holes in your gut, right? But so our team was trying to come up with a better way of describing gut inflammation, basically, because a lot of people say it, but we don't think they truly understand. So I'm going to try to quickly kind of describe what gut inflammation is or leaky gut is and how you can detect it. You can detect it in our stool tests. So when you eat, digestion begins in the saliva, obviously, so you're chewing properly and all that is really important. And then it goes through your esophagus, it goes through your stomach, and then small intestines is where a lot of the nutrients are absorbed, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a biologist, but yeah, you can probably
No, you have
describe.
a remarkable biological knowledge, which I always admire in somebody like yourself, who's really more a technical person. So I'm always amazed at your biological knowledge and understanding, so it's
I'm trying to just come at it from a layperson because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not a biologist, but like my brain works differently, right? So that's why I really wanted to explain what gut inflammation is so that people understand it, right? Because if you don't understand it, how do you even tackle, how can you even take steps to really improve it, right? Or prevent it? So when the foods then, like, as I mentioned, so the small intestines absorb the nutrients in your food, and then it reaches your large intestines. And that's where most of the gut functions. And this is where your gut microbiome is so crucial in not just digesting food, but immune regulation and like you'll work with the gut-brain connection, producing molecules or compounds to calm your mind and reduce anxiety and things like that. A lot of the serotonin and dopamine is actually manufactured in our gut by these gut microbes, right? So just the gut microbiome is represented by the microbes in the large intestines, right? And so what happens when there is gut inflammation is like the large intestines has, I think if you lay it all out, is as big as was it a tennis field or a football field? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
tennis court.
Yeah, tennis court, right? So it's huge surface area, right? But the wall, the lining, the gut lining is made out of just one layer of cells all throughout, right? And what connects the cells from one to another is these tight junctions, almost like if you think about it as the fence to a castle, it's like the joints from the gate, right? So I was trying to equate our immune system when we say 70% or 80% of our immune system is in the gut. It's like we think of it as the castle analogy because, like castles, you have a kingdom and you have these guards, soldiers protecting the kingdom in a way, right? And then you may have enemies trying to shoot in arrows in and like attack the kingdom. So your gut, your large intestine is kind of like that. And your immune cells are right behind that single wall, that cellular wall is like the fence around the castle, supporting and protecting your immune system. And your immune cells are like the good soldiers right behind that fence. So when you have gut inflammation, it may mean that the tight junctions that is kind of holding the gate together is weak, and there's a hole in the gate. And so when food particles or bad bacteria like E. coli or Salmonella passes through, it could leak into the blood system, the bloodstream, and then your immune cells that the good soldier are like responding to it and like fighting it and trying to tackle it, right? But it's not just the bad bacteria, like which is we can measure through a metric called hexa-LPS, which stands for hexalipopolysaccharides. Basically, it's the measurement of E. coli type bacteria in your gut. So you don't want high amounts because it may mean there's a lot of bad soldiers out on the castle, like trying to leak in or shoot arrows in. There's also something around the castle that's the moat of the castle. Castles have like a water system around it. That's the mucus layer in your gut. So, in the gut lining, there's a mucus layer that prevents those bad bacteria or soldiers from like penetrating the castle. So even before they reach the wall, think of mucus layer as like the sticky like water and the moat protecting the castle. So, and guess what? Like there are bacteria that replenishes that moat, that mucus layer. And there's also bacteria that eats up the mucus layer. So if you have a lot of mucus degrading or mucus eating bugs that are eating the mucus layer and like making that moat really thin, then that bad bacteria can actually more easily penetrate the castle, right? So you want to make sure you don't have a lot of those mucus degrading bacteria. And there could also be hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria when you get smelly gas and all that, like that could mean that you have more of those hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. So you don't want both of those. And both of those metrics you can actually measure in a tiny health test. So we have hexa-LPS, how much bad bacteria you have. We have mucus degrading bacteria. Do you have a lot of those? If you do, it's not good, and we give you an action plan to reduce that. Do you have a lot of hydrogen sulfide bacteria? Also, there are ways to reduce that are clinically backed. So there's these three components that make up your castle defense system, so to speak. And if you have high of all of those, that means your gut lining and your castle defense system is weak. And then things can penetrate through your bloodstream and cause actual blood inflammation. So gut inflammation is almost a precursor of blood inflammation, which you can measure through HSCRP, something that you would go to a Quest lab and take a measurement for. You don't want that. By that time, it's like, an inflammatory state. So you want to protect that gut lining and keep that castle defense system strong. And you can support that by eating more fiber, for example.
Yeah, sort of this castle analogy kind of reminds me of the movie I've recently watched, Gladiator 2 movie, where this battle, where these ships trying to attack this town, and there's obviously the water layer, and then there's the big wall, and so
Oh, I haven't seen that movie.
yeah, highly recommendable.
Uh-huh.
But it's an excellent illustration of what goes on in the gut with a lot of interactions. We don't see that when we, as gastroenterologists, when we do an endoscopy or even on the biopsy, we don't see it. But there's a lot of activity going on of defense mechanisms and and certain bacteria. I mean, even the good ones, if the mucus layer is compromised, even the good ones will be able to activate
Immune response, right?
the immune response. So
Mhm.
the mucus layer is probably equally important, or maybe even more important in the average population than these tight junctions between the epithelial cells. And I should add to it, so what you said, it's the colon, but I personally have come more and more to the conclusion a lot of this must go on in the end of the small intestine, in the so-called distal small intestine, because the vagus nerve, for example, which is a big mechanism to signaling to the brain, the innervation in humans is in the distal ileum, very complex innervation of these sensors, but not in the colon. So the colon has its own signaling mechanisms, but I think probably the best way to sort of divide the intestine up in these different regional domains is proximal small intestine, obviously perfect in absorption of all these non-fiber, the Western diet kind of food components. The distal small intestine plays a much bigger role because there's more bacteria in these microbial processes, and then the proximal colon, the first part of the colon, plays an important role, not just in storage, which is more the end of the colon, but in these same signaling mechanisms to to the body and to the brain. But what you described is, in that analogy with the castle wall, with the two barriers, I think it's perfect. I think,
Yeah. And I think like even upstream, right? Because like, some people come to us and like want to measure if they have a leaky gut or gut inflammation and they don't see any of those factors being flagged. But then the precursor to that is short-chain fatty acids like butyrate function, right? There's butyrate, acetate, propionate, but butyrate for adults is the most important. Acetate, on the other hand, is more important in infancy, which is kind of different from adults. But butyrate, I would say, is kind of like the heroes of the castle workers who are running to like paint the fence and kind of keep the fence strong and make sure the fence is like renewed every year and things like
yeah.
that. So if not, and the way you get your butyrate function up is to eat more specific fibers, right? So we're not like, we're not proposing to be vegetarian or vegan here, but I am a meat eater. I eat a lot of healthy grass-fed meat, but that has to be balanced by sufficient fiber to make sure that you have sufficient butyrate function. Because if you don't have sufficient butyrate function, then that kind of weakens the gut lining, that castle wall that we're just talking about. And there's other healthy microbes because we talked about the hexa LPS, mucus degraders, and hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. They're all kind of bad stuff. But on the other hand, like I mentioned, butyrate is a beneficial function, right? And then also Archimencia, for example. Archimencia is this bacteria that replenishes that mucus lining that we're talking about, that the moat, right, to keep it healthy. So it kind of regenerates every couple of weeks, I believe. So a lot of people are missing Archimencia these days. We see that in, I can't remember, like 80% of our adults are missing Archimencia, which is like a really large number. And it is important to protect the gut lining, but also for metabolic health. It has the ability to produce GLP-1 actually, so that that you may know, but your gut can produce GLP-1 compounds from Archimencia. I'm not like an expert in this topic, but it just goes to show that you want to measure if you have Archimencia, if you have butyrate function, if you have bifidobacteria, for example.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of, since you mentioned Akkermansia, I mean, there's been a lot of misunderstanding or lack of understanding because Akkermansia feeds on the mucus layer. I mean, it's sugar molecules that they love. Many microbes love sugar molecules. But what Akkermansia does at the same time, it eats the mucus layer, it stimulates the production of mucus in other cell types in the gut, like these, mucus producing cells. So it actually stimulates the turnover. It's a healthy function. And so initially, when Akkermansia was sort of propagated as the second generation probiotic, that question often was not answered. Why would it be good to have something that gobbles down your mucus layer? But
Mm.
it's the turnover,
Yeah,
that is.
yeah, exactly. So we call it replenishing the mucus layer, but yeah, similar to that, it stimulates, yeah, the
Yeah.
production of mucus. But it also, you're right, it also degrades mucus. So we see, actually, we talked about antibiotics. Post antibiotics, Akkermansia shoots up really high. Like sometimes in someone, we see 20-25% Akkermansia. And then in some papers that are published, Akkermansia is linked to certain autoimmune conditions, actually. So some people are like, oh, Akkermansia may be bad. But we think internally at Tiny Health, our scientists think that it's not like it's a bad bug. It's actually a really crucial and important beneficial bug. But when I think we think like Akkermansia reacts like it's almost like a host immune response to an inflammatory event, like maybe taking antibiotics, or maybe you got sick, and we don't really know why Akkermansia spikes up, but we think it's a response to some inflammatory event, because usually when we see that, and then the next test, it really comes back down.
Yeah. So the last question, maybe we could go on for a while still, but since we've come to the end of this conversation, I was going to mention one area. So our center, has had a longstanding research interest and clinical interest and NIH funding support for the last 20 years in the area of brain gut microbiome interactions in women, and to look at the sex difference between, how is the system different in men and women. Hopefully we'll get continued funding with the current administration. So of great practical importance for many women are gut-related symptoms, particularly perimenopause and menopause and postmenopause stages. What value does gut microbiome testing have to address these questions?
Yeah, it's definitely an area of increasing inquiry and demand. A lot of our customers are, like they came in. I mean, they have their kids, but they're like they have maybe grandmothers who are at the menopause stage, or like we're getting increasing audience of women who are at that perimenopause menopausal stage. But yeah, like from the gut perspective, there's definitely like a lot of things you can measure. For example, we have a measurement called beta glucuronidase that we can measure in the gut. Um, and that affects estrogen recycling in women. So, like the sort of like, how do you say, a woman's microbiome kind of changes over their lifetime, right? When they're in their puberty stage, estrogen increases, and that produces a lot of hormonal changes in the female body. And you brought up gut microbiome, but vaginal microbiome is also a really important piece of it, because as estrogen increase, it encourages the production of lactobacillus species in the vaginal microbiome. And that's really important for like helping with reproductive abilities, right? So your vaginal microbiome should be high lactobacillus, which produces lactic acid and reduces the pH of the vaginal microbiome to keep out pathogenic or disruptive bacteria from inhabiting the vaginal microbiome. And so there are some signs pointing to the fact that if the women's vaginal microbiome is high in pH or more alkali and less acidic, it's harder to conceive, actually, and the IVF implantation rates are lower. So I think that's a proxy for fertility. So you want to make sure that the vaginal microbiome is in good shape. And then, as the woman kind of gets pregnant, there's a correlation, you get into a more metabolic state where, like the risk for gestational diabetes is a little bit higher. So you want to measure from a gut microbiome perspective if the woman has, sort of that microbiome risk, and to take actions to reduce that risk. And then you get into like sort of postpartum, perimenopausal stage, where then estrogen levels reduce. And that actually causes the lactobacillus in the vaginal microbiome to decrease. And so that's where you get vaginal dryness, maybe discharge and odors and things like that. It's because that estrogen is decreasing and affecting the less lactobacillus dominance in the vaginal microbiome. So definitely the vaginal microbiome has a lot, there's a lot to kind of link up with the perimenopausal menopause stage. And then from the gut, I'm not a super like an expert in this, but the recycling of estrogen is really important. And when as a declining estrogen happens, you also get it could disrupt the estrobolome, which can be measured by beta-glucuronidase. So we have that index in our tests to see if you have proper estrogen recycling, which is really important to maintain circulating estrogen in your levels. So there are things you can do to increase those levels or decrease them if necessary. Certain therapies you can do and HRTs and suppositories you can do to help the vaginal microbiome, for example. So it's emerging research for sure, but it's definitely something that we're paying attention to.
But do you look at the vaginal microbiome with any test?
Yeah, we have a vaginal microbiome test on Tiny
Okay.
Health. Yeah.
Yeah, so our center, we have one investigator who's primarily focused on this beta-glucuronidase testing, and we don't have the time to get. This is a topic by itself, which I find absolutely fascinating because it has a lot of therapeutic implications in the future. How the composition of your gut microbiome, and the prevalence of this enzyme could be influenced in a way that it increases postmenopausal estrogen levels without taking estrogen replacement therapy. So yeah, I share your enthusiasm about this. Maybe in the future, sometimes we can have a separate conversation on
Dive into that, right? And
to
what
dive into
that
this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It also has like, we think that's a women's enzyme to measure in the gut, but for men, it has repercussions too. Because if you have too high of a beta gluc in men, you may have trouble like reacting to certain medications, right? So it has repercussions for men as well, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Cheryl. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. This was wonderful, very informative. I love it that it confirms many of my concepts and ideas, and it's great that you open up this information to the average viewer of our podcast. And have explained in a very simple and clear way, very difficult, situations, and why testing the stool microbiome and the vaginal microbiome are important for your health, for the health of the whole family, from the infant, to the postmenopausal state. So thanks a lot for the communication and the time you spent, and I'm looking forward to working with your company as an advisor.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really had fun, enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to working with you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.